On March 16, 2021, 6 women were among the victims of a horrific shooting in Georgia. They were grandmothers, mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives. They were killed because they were Asian. But anti-Asian violence is not new. It is part of our collective memory.
As the families in Georgia mourn and memorialize the lives of their loved ones, we remember the history of racism our community has faced. In 1875, the Page Act passes, banning Chinese women from entering the United States. It's the first federal law to limit immigration.
In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act passes, prohibiting Asian immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens. Its discriminatory practices survive for over 80 years. In 1885, 28 Chinese Americans are lynched and murdered in Rock Springs, Wyoming.
1930, across California, hundreds of Filipino American farm workers injured and scores killed by rioters. 1942, 120,000 Japanese Americans incarcerated in concentration camps by our own government.
1982, Vincent Chin beat to death by 2 men with a baseball bat right before his wedding. Mistaken for being Japanese, accused of stealing their jobs. 1989, 5 Vietnamese and Cambodian children killed, more than 30 wounded. Stockton, California.
In the wake of September 11, 2001, attacks against Muslims and South Asians surge. 2012, 6 Sikh Americans killed in a temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin.
This past year, almost 4,000 incidents of anti-Asian violence, including murders of our elders simply walking in their own neighborhoods.
Memory is the antidote to death. Solidarity is the answer to silence.
As activist Valerie Kaur once asked, what if this is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb?
Today, we birth something new, knowing it's up to all of us to keep each other safe and shine a light together.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's panel on violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, a conversation about solutions. The College of Arts and Humanities is hosting this panel because we would like to further the discussion and help our community grow from it. I would like to thank the chair of the Department of Media, Communications, and Journalism, Betsy Hayes, for her hard work on organizing this panel, as well as the executive director of the Institute for Media and Public Trust, Jim Boren, for helping to host this event, along with other organizations on campus. I would now like to introduce our wonderful interim provost, Dr. Zhuaning Fu, who has so kindly joined us tonight.
Thank you, Dean Chapman. Thank all of you, faculty, staff, and friends, and campus community. I'm honored to be here today to be part of this seminar and educational session so we can all understand how we can stand together against violence. That is the part of the historical evil of this nation. We need to stand together, and all people stand together. We know that the recent rise in hostility against Asian Americans reflects the nation's long history of brutal bigotry against this particular group of people, Americans. In modern American history, as we just watched from the short video, Asian Americans have been regularly scapegoated during the periods of national stress. World War II saw the forced internment of about 120,000 Japanese Americans, and the majority of them were US citizens. We also know that after the Vietnam War, refugees from Southeast Asia faced routine discrimination and hate. And the example mentioned in the video, in 1982, Vincent Chen, a Chinese American, was beaten to death because he was mistaken as Japanese, and the Japanese were considered the evil nation. Japan was considered at that time the source of trouble because the auto workers' job was taken away. Today, we saw a continuation of this violence against Asians when the nation is under stress of the COVID-19. And the Asian Americans once again became a scapegoat. And we see even a worse form of violence and discrimination against Asians, with the numerous examples of senior Asian Americans beaten for no reason in public places, such as subway stations and even on the streets of San Francisco. And the only way we can fight back and build our nation as a better place for all people to live is to unite, speak out, and get all peoples behind us and be part of us, and lobby our elected officials and the government passing laws as we just did, and continue the education as we are good at, as university faculty, staff, and friends and community of the university. And we also need to remember, this is not a day's job. It is not that the violence against Asians will go away because we have today's seminar. And we need to continue this education, our generation and our children's generation and their children's generation, until all people in this nation are truly treated equal and live in harmony with each other. Once again, my heartfelt thank you to all of you hosting this seminar. You put in a lot of hours of your time, your heart, and work. And I hope that we continue sessions of education like this. And I'm standing by to offer all I can to help and promote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fu, for those inspiring words. We are so appreciative of your support of the panelists and of our community as well. Tonight, we plan to explore the violence with our esteemed panel of experts from our campus, while exploring issues of media coverage, myths about Asian Americans, and what we can all do next. I would now like to introduce our moderator, and I'm so grateful for her joining us tonight. Zara Arboleda, who taught me how to pronounce her name, and I butchered it, apologies, is the Director of Communications and Public Relations at Valley Children's Healthcare. The two-time Emmy Award winner spent 2 decades in television news, most recently with CBS 47 in Fresno. Arboleta, the daughter of Filipino immigrants, is a first-generation Asian American born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. She is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism and an even more proud mother of 2. Thank you so much, Zara.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Chapman, Dr. Fu, Jim, and Betsy. You've all made me honorary bulldogs, so I thank you, an honorary bulldog. Honored, so honored to be asked to take part in this conversation about solutions. And we are here today to talk about solutions because we all know the problem, as you saw, from February of last year to March of this year, 3,800 attacks against Asian Americans, many of those against our elders, the majority of those against women. And those 3,800 were just the ones that were reported. So now the question is, what do we do? Because this is a deeply personal, deeply traumatic course of events that is affecting not only obviously the victims of the violence against the AAPI community, but all of us who are members of this community, and not only here in the United States, but worldwide. I am honored to have 4 amazing panelists joining me today. We have a lot to discuss, so I'm just going to do some quick bios. You can read about them more on Fresno State's website. In alphabetical order, we're going to start with Bunia Lee. Bo is also a former journalist, a recovered newsie like myself, spent 15 years with the Fresno Bee, winning awards, enacting change with her investigative journalism. Bo is now a communications specialist at Fresno State. Bo, thanks so much for your time here tonight. We've got Bryn Saito, a poet, organizer, also an assistant professor of creative writing and English at Fresno State, a published author, also a 2-time recipient of the Civil Liberties Public Education Grant for her work with the Yonsei Memory Project. And it's so fitting right now that you're doing this, Bryn, which connects, she co-founded it, connects the World War II era incarceration of Japanese Americans with the current struggles for justice that we are all here to discuss today. She's been featured in the New York Times, Vogue, and the American Poetry Review. Bryn, thank you for your time today. Devorn Sisavat is an assistant professor of ethnic studies in the Department of Anthropology and Asian American Studies program, also at Fresno State, currently working on a manuscript that's exploring metallic violence and examining it in post-war spaces, including in Laos, Iraq, and the United States. She's also on the board of directors for Stone Soup Fresno, a wonderful community organization here in town, and vice president of Central California Asian Pacific Women. Devorn, thank you for your time. And she was in meetings up until like 2 minutes ago. So they're all very extremely busy. So we're very grateful. And then we also have Varaxi Yi, assistant professor of educational leadership at Fresno State, coordinator for the Higher Education Administration and Leadership Graduate Program, and a core faculty member in the doctoral program in educational leadership. She conducts research to advance equity, access, and opportunity for historically underserved communities, such as Southeast Asian American and refugee populations. So Varaxi, thank you for your time today as well. One thing that we were all struggling with before this is, where do we even start? And before we can start talking about solutions, we do have to look a bit at the past. And so I want to open this up with the myth, a couple of myths, with the first one being the model minority. We have all heard it. I went to Mizzou, and when I went there, I was part of a population of fewer than 2% of Asian Americans on that campus. And I was sharing the story with some of you today. One of my really dear friends had a crush on a Mexican boy who lived in the dorm next door. And she said, "Oh, I really like him, but I could never take him home." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, because he's a minority." And I said, "So am I, and I've spent holidays at your house." And she said, "But you're a different kind of minority." And on the one hand, I was like, okay, phew. And then on the other hand, I thought, what does that even mean? And I'm sure I'm not alone. So I would love to bring the panelists in to talk about this whole model minority myth. Why don't we start with Bryn?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to my fellow panelists and to everyone here today and to Fresno State for just bringing us together. This is, I think I've seen or met all of you in virtual spaces before and have really appreciated the work you're all doing in your departments and the community. And so it's really an honor to be in this space with you all. I think sometimes where I begin with the model minority myth is just sort of remembering when it first became kind of widely circulated in the 1960s, actually by a white sociologist, right, at UC Berkeley. And he was talking in particular about the Japanese Americans who had just endured, the World War II incarceration and the camps. And there was something in his article about how they were doing so well. They were, for a minority group that had gone through so much, like, look how well they were doing, and they were succeeding, and they were sort of becoming these great American citizens. And why can't other minorities do that? And in particular, he was talking about Black Americans. And so the model minority myth from its inception really was this wedge, which was this way to separate all minority communities, right? It's like, you are the good ones, you are not. Why can't we all just look like this group over here? Because this group looks most like white America, to some degree, and is assimilating or whatnot. So that's an interesting kind of point of history for me to always sort of think about when it comes to that myth, and ways to start to begin to dispel it. So maybe I'll pass it off to one of my other panelists to further talk about that phenomenon.
Yeah, feel free to speak up. As soon as I see you unmute, I'm calling on you. So I see Devorn there has unmuted. So why don't you go next?
I'm unmuted, sure, definitely. Thank you so much for providing this space. And I'm very, very fortunate to be in this space with my amazing panelists and having the opportunity to collaborate and work with all of you on this panel. And, to reiterate what Bryn has mentioned, right? The myth runs deep in the American psyche, right? I mean, this portrayal of Asians as, a monolithic group who are quiet, who are hardworking, political silent, and well-behaved immigrants. And this particular topic is always part of my class discussions. And part of it is a lot of my students who come into the classroom taking Asian American Studies courses often are confused about the model minority myth, right? Not really having the language or tool to critically disentangle the ways in which the myth was created, right, by this white sociologist, as Bryn had mentioned. And really a myth that was created, right, to position Asians in opposition to Black communities. And the myth is very pervasive and rooted in the ideas of merit and hard work that we've seen in this particular rise of anti-Blackness within the Asian American community, right? It benefits Asian Americans at the exclusion of Black Americans. And, what it ultimately does is it erases, it makes invisible, it even delegitimizes Asian communities, material conditions and real lived experience, right? And struggles by using the economic success of the few who have succeeded to ultimately defend this unjust system that's really rooted in white supremacy and anti-Blackness and capitalism and imperialism. And so I really liked how you brought up the model minority myth for us to really open up the conversations to think about anti-Asian violence and the history and the ways in which it's really embedded in white supremacy, which is why there's this increase, right, and ongoing violence in our society, and what we're seeing here in, at this particular moment, anti-Asian violence.
Thank you for that. And that does bring up the Black Lives Matter movement of last summer. For me, I thought, it's great to see other Asians, other AAPI community members getting involved in this. But something that you wanted to touch on, Varaxi, is that it's also a myth that Asians aren't activists, that we have a long history of being active and trying to enact change. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Zara. Based on our conversation and building upon what Dr. Sisavat and Dr. Sato have already shared, something that I've come to learn as well, right? Just recently, if you will, because our history are not taught in K-12 education. You're not going to get access to the history of Asian American communities unless you're taking an ethnic studies program, and we know the struggle already to maintain and support ethnic studies in our curriculum. But I do want to highlight the fact that, yes, Asian Americans have always been involved in civil rights movements, in activism, on various levels, right? When you were talking about Grace Lee Boggs or Yuri Kochiyama, right? And so I want to reiterate and highlight that this idea of Asian Americans as silent, as politically silent, as Dr. Sisavat mentioned, is a myth. And so we need to really understand and underscore the point that stereotypes such as the model minority myth and other stereotypes really essentialize large groups of people right, down to a very basic level, right, that really discounts the humanity, the agency, and the resiliency of the group. And so I also now want to highlight how even now the activism that we see in response to the violence has been solidarity focused, right? Asian and Black communities working together to come up with community solutions to this instead of relying and reinforcing the carceral system in our country. And so it is a myth. We need to continue to challenge it. I think we are, I'm hopeful that we continue to have a political, racial awakening, a move towards critical consciousness to kind of understand how we all have a role to play here, that we have the ability to be activists in our whatever role that we play, right? And so that's something that we need to support and encourage in our communities, especially with our students at Fresno State as well.
And I want to shift the conversation now to Fresno State students and the journalism school that you have here, and also talk about media coverage in general. I'd like to bring in Bo for this one. Bo, obviously, more than a decade in journalism. Tell me what you've seen as far as the direction that media coverage has kind of gone in, and what maybe we can do for, because I'm sure we've got some J School students here who are watching, and others from around the community, because it's important to cover these stories, but also to put them in context. You can't just say, oh, someone got attacked without looking at the why and without really explaining it as far as how that relates to the broader community. I'd love your thoughts on media coverage of what's been happening in the AAPI community and to the AAPI community.
Yeah, I think that we can all agree there has been a lack in coverage of various events that have happened to folks in the Asian American community over the years. And just recently, because of these events, we're seeing more coverage, obviously. And, starting with the attacks on our elderly in the various cities across our country. And that's stirring up a lot of emotion in those of us who are watching the news or reading the news. And then I feel like it really jumped even more after the Atlanta attacks, right? The Atlanta deaths and whatnot. And so coverage really, everybody just swarmed there, right? And started covering. We had Asian media covering it. You had local media covering it. It was just crazy. And yes, word choice, how you cover it was very important. There was a lot of discussion about the ways that people were describing the suspect and what he did versus, not, versus the people saying, no, he didn't really do that. And then there was a lot of controversy over, not talking about the victims or victimizing them in a way that, was just not correct. These were victims in spas. And so there was a lot of coverage about, what that meant or what these women were like in spas. And so there was just a lot of stuff happening there that we really need to get to the bottom of and think closely about how those stories want to be told and shared.
Something that reminded me during all the coverage after the shootings, there was some media criticism because the news anchors, were not pronouncing the victims' names. And there was some chatter on social media that they weren't pronouncing it because they said the names are too hard. And it's like, wait a second, you cannot continue to dehumanize these already victimized people by not learning. But I've heard that before. Bo, how many times have you had to be like, this is my name, this is how you say it, Dr. Chapman, I'm not picking on you, I promise. But it's very real that people try to just kind of lump all Asians together and not really give them the coverage that they deserve. And so it's been pretty interesting to see the shift over the past year, especially, really honing in on that. But it was something that I'm going to open this up to the panel. I know I'm supposed to call on you individually, but I don't know who wants to take this one. Something that the common thinking is that the violence that we've been seeing is a result of the Trump administration's anti-Asian rhetoric. However, what we're seeing is a large number of these attacks happening in what is traditionally thought of as these more liberal educated, woke cities. The most recent one 2 days ago, 2 women were attacked, 2 Asian Americans were attacked in New York City. And NYPD released the disturbing surveillance video over the last 24 hours trying to find the suspects. Does anyone want to speak to why it seems like, I mean, San Francisco, you would think, oldest, biggest Chinatown in the country, attacks on elders are happening there too. Who would like to take that? Because it seems like it's off. It doesn't seem to fit the narrative.
I guess I'll take a try with this. I think number one, most definitely the anti-Asian rhetoric stemming from the previous Trump administration played a hand in this, right? Making it more acceptable to spout anti-Asian rhetoric. In terms of media coverage, reported acts of anti-Asian incidents, especially in areas, large urban metropolitan areas where there is more likelihood of cross-racial, engagement, interaction. There's that piece, but also we have to recognize the socioeconomic class, the ways that we as a nation do not offer equitable access to workforce, to education. And so many of our communities of color are still engaging or living in areas that are low resourced, right? And so we also have to recognize that this pitting, the model minority myth idea as a racial wedge, pitting communities of color against each other to fight for scarce resources produces, opportunities for violence, right? Because the system, our white supremacist system, does not allow for or support this flow of resources in equitable ways to communities, right? And so we can't necessarily separate these what seems to be individual acts of violence, right? Like we tend to, as a society, tend to reduce racism sometimes to the individual acts and not look at the systemic factors, systemic issues that really create the conditions for these individual interactions to happen. And so in thinking about this, in my response to this, I think there are so many factors that create these conditions that we have to address. And while there are trends, right? Like while the data might show trends, like there's more, and there's always more to the story. And I want to reiterate how it is rooted in these white supremacist structures that produce these conditions.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add to that. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, that the kind of the Trump moment and the rhetoric was also just part of a long history, right? That we saw in that opening video. And as Dr. Yi is saying, to think structurally and think historically about these acts of violence, to think about them within a system and within a history that, from the Page Act to Chinese exclusion to Japanese American incarceration to Vincent Chin, all these moments are historically linked or structurally linked to white supremacy, to racism, and then to the other isms that have sort of targeted communities, all minority communities. And I think that's the trick, right? Sometimes I think about that as like building our muscles or building our activist muscles, like learning to sort of think and feel on the individual personal level and the interpersonal level, but also on this kind of structural historical level, which is tougher, and I think panels like this and the resources we'll share afterwards and practices we'll get into might help us to kind of build those muscles to think in those ways to better sort of contextualize, right, this moment.
Bo mentioned the Atlanta shootings, and the majority of those victims were not only Asian, but female. And that brings up a great, there's a question in the chat. So thank you to all of you who are watching right now. Feel free to keep those questions coming. You can either do it in the chat or in the Q&A box that you have there. And Simmerpreet, see, here I go. Simmerpreet Kaur asks, as for the attacks that happened recently with Asian people, we can definitely say that more women have been targets. And that is true. Stop AAPI Hate did find that about 60-ish, 68% of the victims in the recent rash of crimes against AAPI community members, the victims were female. And so Simmerpreet is asking, do you think if we have more awareness and opportunities for Asian women, we can actually start to decrease those incidents? Devorn or Bo, or anyone else on that panel, any thoughts on that? Because like both Varaxi and Bryn mentioned, it's not just one thing. There are questions of equity, there are questions of education, all kinds of other factors that come into play.
Sure, I can try to touch on that. Dr. Yi and Dr. Sato brought up a really great point in terms of linking, right? And really thinking about the historical context and the structural context. And in relation to Simmerpreet's question about awareness and opportunities, I think one of the things that we have to really recognize and be honest with each other and ourselves is to part of linking solutions to solidarity is to really acknowledge racism and white supremacy, right? I mean, that's really the root of race-related violence in the US, but also gendered violence too, right? We saw this with the, what happened in Atlanta. And so, one of the things that we have to recognize is that white supremacy is an ideology. It's this pattern of values and beliefs that are ingrained, as Dr. Yi and Dr. Sato has mentioned, in every system and institution in the US. And so part of that awareness is to acknowledge, but part of the solution is to really learn about the history, right? Provide resources. And there's so many web resources and websites that have popped up since the shooting in Atlanta in terms of what can you do as an ally, right? What can you do to stop anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian hate incidents? And one of those, solution, I don't know if solution is the right word for it, but one of the solution is to learn about the history of Asian Americans, right? To learn about this long history of violence towards Asian Americans that's not just, that just happened, right? Just recently with the pandemic, but it is ongoing. What we saw with the pandemic was this re-emergence of the yellow peril, idea of the ways in which Asians are viewed as different and other, right? And so that has been embedded in our system from the Page Act to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the laws and the policies are very much part of it. So part of the awareness is to really, learn about the history of Asian Americans, learn about the history of Asian American women. I teach a course on Asian American women, and part of the course is about relational, comparative, and solidarity and collaborative working in terms of not only about Asian American women's experience, but also how that is related to, Black women's experience and Latinas women's experience and Indigenous women's experience.
So Bo Wang has a question, and there's two, but the first one is anti-Asian racism, as we've all touched on already, has deep roots in US history. How do you see anti-Asian racism evolving, especially in the context of today's global geopolitics, white supremacy, the demonization of China? And Devorn, that kind of reminds me along these same lines. You're saying learn more, but you have to seek it out because the schools aren't teaching it. We've seen it with Native American history. We've seen it with Black history. We're now seeing it with, so how can we even begin to educate when we have to be proactive and seek it? Because to me, Native American, Black, Asian history, that shouldn't be separated out. That's all US history. So how do you move down that path so that it's not me? You know, I've got a 7th grader and a 6th grader. I shouldn't have to seek out alternate educational materials to help them. They should be learning about this in school too.
I just want, and this is going to be a short comment, but I just want to highlight and read, this is how white supremacist ideology works, right? There is a reason why history of communities of color are not taught in U.S. school systems. And so if we, I would argue and say that if we had enough desire from parents and from, from folks who are interested in this work to fight for districts to include the curriculum, to fight for the states to pass, ethnic studies or not just ethnic studies as adjacent, but incorporating it into the mainstream history, classes. That might be one way to help move us closer or away from these white supremacist ideologies and history. But I just want to point out, this is how it works, that this idea that Asian American, Black history is not useful or relevant or should be in this mainstream classes. And so we talk about how we need to change policies and laws in order to incorporate this history into our education, but that requires people. It requires, votes. It requires that type of consciousness to move us towards that. That doesn't answer your question, but I just want to point out this is the way it's supposed to work.
No, that's very valid. And it reminds me, Bryn, of your work with the Yonsei Memory Project. I mean, when I was in school, the imprisonment of so many Japanese Americans was maybe a blurb in the section on World War II. And so how do you begin to add that more? It's not one, to me, it's not like, oh, mom and dad should be demanding it. It's like, well, shouldn't the textbook authors start doing this stuff? I don't know, Bryn, you must encounter that with the Yonsei Memory Project and just lack of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something we've started to do just on the community level, and Nikiko Masamoto and I, before the pandemic and the shutdown, was we did these tours, locally around Fresno, of different sites of incarceration here in the Valley, right? Before our Japanese American elders were sent to the camps, further east, they were put in the Fresno Fairgrounds, a makeshift prison, right, in the Fresno Fairgrounds, and one Pinedale in North Fresno. So there are sites right here in our valley, right, that root us in these histories of anti-Asian racism and redlining practices in downtown Fresno, and just, sort of learning about. And maybe that's one way we've thought as a way in, was just learning about our local history and the land we live on and the stories here, and how do we awaken sort of each other to those stories. But I agree with Dr. Yi, it's this institutional power structure of education that ultimately we need to confront, and we need to continue to do the work on that level too, to get it in the curriculum, to get things required. And again, I'm looking at Dr. Wong's question in the Q&A, and I think this is my colleague, Bo Wong, who's done so much work around this. And I just want to appreciate, her for being here and her for this question. And I just want to note, kind of to her question, that the demonization of China in mainstream corporate media certainly led to these direct targeted attacks. And we've seen that, right, in history as well, how these imperialist wars or these ways of demonizing these countries like Japan and China and Vietnam, et cetera, led to violence here, in the United States. And perhaps one of my colleagues can speak a little bit more to that geopolitical connection that Dr. Wong is speaking to.
And that's interesting, because what happens with the demonization of China is that you tend to lump all Asians together. We have all heard it at one time or another. You're all the same. You all look the same. I can't tell you guys apart, whatever it might be. Do you think that is factoring in as well, that it's not just anti-China, anti-China, anti-China? It's kind of just, they figure we're all the same, when Asians are so diverse. But do you think that collectively, Bo, from a media perspective, what you've seen, do you think that people are not taking the time to look at just how diverse our AAPI community actually is?
Definitely. I think people still, like you said, lump us into one group. But I was born and raised on the East Coast in central New York, and so when I came to Fresno, it was just like my eyes just opened up so wide because there's so many different groups of Asian people here in Fresno. There, the Japanese who have been here for so long, and for the longest time, I grew up around people who had a lot of different Asian accents because they were new arrivals, right? New arrivals to the East Coast. But here in Fresno, you've had generations of families who have lived here forever, and their English was just so great. And I remember I applied for a job, and when I left that job, my colleague said to me, "Oh, I remember our boss saying, she has such great English. I thought she was going to have an accent." I'm American born and raised, and English was my first language. So yeah, it's incredible. I think people need to take more time to learn about all of us. I'm Hmong, Zara, you're Filipino. We're all so different, and the cultures are all so different. The languages are all so different. But I think people just see, they just see race. They don't see ethnicity and culture. And even people in our family, my family in town, have had people stop their cars and run out and start yelling at them because they're Asian and telling them to go home, or just screaming and yelling at them and saying bad words and whatnot. So yeah, there needs to be an education on their part. But how do we do that? How do we educate people to have better understanding of all of us and our differences?
Well, and part of that stems from media coverage. And so Boeing had a second part of the question. It's like, well, so what can you do, especially for those who are watching right now, who are in media? What can you do to transform these institutions? And Bo had mentioned that have perpetuated anti-Asian racism, and to try and help promote ethical practices of reporting.
I think it's on the reporter and the editing team to make sure that they're reaching out to community organizations that can really help them understand either the culture or the people or the situation that's happening. I used to cover a lot of domestic violence in the Hmong community, and it was very difficult because, one, people didn't want to talk about it, or, well, they didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want you, the media, to mess it up. They didn't want you to say, bad things or make it seem like this was happening all the time in that one group, right? So I think it's on media to reach out and really understand the issues and find the people who could speak to it very well. Not just someone because they've been out there preaching it all the time, but really the people who work in these areas or with these issues. During the Atlanta attacks, the Asian Journalism Association, they were just on it and getting information out there to reporters about how to report on this incident. And their website crashed that day. That's never happened before because they put out these set of guidelines to help journalists as they were covering it. So, things like that. But also I'll say that I think newsrooms have to have ethnic reporters on their teams so that they know and they can reach out to the community and really cover it well because they understand what's happening.
Question coming in the chat. I had never heard this. A new term I recently read about, boba liberalism, defines as appeals to the idea of white adjacency. If this is true, what can the AAPI community do? That's a new one. Our educators who are here, have you heard of boba liberalism? No, I see.
I just had to Google it.
Yeah.
I still don't know what it is and haven't had a chance to look at it, but this question is just making me think of Asian American as a pan-ethnic identity and as political identity, right? I think we have to come to terms as a group. We have to come to terms with our role and our position in this white supremacist institution. And we have been given, right? We give whoever the system has decided to give certain benefits to Asian American groups as a reward for certain types of behaviors and certain types of, of just being, of living in this country, which comes out of this idea of like, the model minority myth, because it comes out of that, right? And so I would, not just me, but I think many of our, folks who do this work, who have been activists, researchers, would argue that, the role that Asian Americans have to play, especially in solidarity efforts, is to come to terms, reckon with our positioning in the ways that we have benefited, right? Some of us, not all communities within the Asian American category. I need to kind of make that clarification. There are differences that we don't have time to talk about, but there has been some benefits, right? And so there isn't a sense of we need to disinvest from this idea that the only way to function in this function successfully in this US system is to be complacent in our positioning in the system. And that means, right, like coming to terms with the idea or the understanding that we need to reject this idea of our communities being used as a wedge. We need to actively reject it. We need to work with solidarity. And I think we don't have a lot of time, and I want to shift this into that idea, the sense of solutions and solidarity that we had a conversation about in preparing for this, is that that is our role, like, recognizing that we have responsibility to not play into this idea of, one group is being pit against each other. It's to actively support causes in which we are impacted, right? For example, the prison system does not only impact Black and Brown communities, right? It also impacts Southeast Asian American men and youth of color who are impacted by profiling, right? And so I think there's a sense of we need to understand that these systems intersect, and communities of color, including Asian Americans, are implicated and are hurt by these intersecting systems of oppression. And so I think I went around in a lot of different directions, but just a acknowledgement that that's our role as Asian American communities, as a political group, is to really reject this idea that, if we stay quiet, if we, enact certain behaviors, we will be unscathed. That is not the truth. And we are impacted by this in, really disparate ways.
And again, from the events from George Floyd on last year and the Black Lives Matter movement, Bryn, you totally opened my eyes when you're like, it was a white sociologist who coined the term, model minority to create it as a wedge. And so there have been a few questions that have come in. Okay, now what? So how do you take these minorities who historically have been driven apart by the powers that be? How do you work together? Because you're right, Asians are not going to no longer be victims unless they've got Blacks, Latinx, and others next to them. And same for the others. So how do you then get rid of that wedge and start working toward everybody being on equal footing? I don't know if Bryn or Devorn would like to speak to that. Because that's part of what people are encountering now. Okay, so now what? We know the wedge is there. How do we get over it together?
Well, I'll just say there's another question in the questions I see here from Gina Lugong too, asking about allyship and so really, and I've been thinking a lot about like, what is allyship? What is solidarity? Whether it's between us within the Asian American, the sort of Pan-Asian American group, or amongst different minority groups. And I guess one tiny story I'll share is my recent work with my good friend Valerie Kaur, who's Sikh, S-I-K-H, Sikh American, and her and I grew up here in the Valley. We were good friends going to Buchanan High School together, and learned years later that her Sikh American grandfather had watched over my elders' farms when they were sent to the camps in Arizona. And later on, after the targeting of Sikh and Muslim Americans after 9/11, the Japanese American Citizens League, kind of made statements and showed up for the Sikh community. And recently, Valerie hosted a solidarity vigil after the shootings in Indianapolis, right, that happened after Atlanta. And folks, rallied again around the Sikh community. And I've realized that, this work of solidarity, it's intimate, and it's about us physically showing up for each other and actively learning about each other's communities. And sometimes it's ancestral, like Valerie's grandparents and my grandparents had this connection we didn't even know about until just, years ago. And so these seeds of solidarity are planted just like together, like us in this group together right now. I may call on these fellow panelists next month, next week, because I'll need something. My community will be in need. And, can I be vulnerable enough to say I'm in need? My community's in need. I need help. Can I also be vulnerable enough to show up, to other communities, to show up when communities are in need? So just that it's this very intimate practice that's about risk and vulnerability, and it's not just about posting a hashtag once or posting a photo or it's not performative, right? So I'd love to hear my other panelists' thoughts on
I'd love to hear Devorn's thoughts on this, because I know you like looking at it at the micro level and then seeing how you can apply that more globally.
Thank you so much. I love what Dr. Sato mentioned, and I think it's so important and necessary in terms of thinking about solidarity and allyship. And one of the things that I tell my students is part of that commitment, right, in terms of solidarity, in terms of allyship, in terms of collective work, it's ongoing, right? It's not something that you just do it and then be done and then move on with your everyday life. It's about making a long-term commitment, a commitment to being anti-racist, right? And I think that's so important and necessary that we understand that. And part of that solidarity and collaborative working is to always show up. Right. I think that's one of the ways that, I tell my students to show up. And showing up doesn't mean having to be present, right? Showing up doesn't mean having to go to a protest. People can show up in different ways, whether it's small or whether it's, being out in front of City Hall, right? And so one of the things that I really appreciate, and I'm going to give a shout out to the amazing AAPI groups on the ground at Fresno, who have collectively worked together and brought all of the different organizations, and we're meeting on a weekly basis to do the work of what anti-Asian hate, what it means to talk about anti-Asian hate in Fresno, but also to find solutions and working with these amazing, individuals and organizations on the ground, passing the city's resolution, right? And holding the city accountable. One of the ways to show up and to make that long-term commitment is support FIRM, support HIP, right? Hmong Innovative Politics, who are leading the charge, and donating or just being there or attending their vigils, or even just checking in. I think that's so important and necessary. I really appreciated my students checking in on me after the Atlanta shooting. Was just like, how are you, Dr. Sisva? Are you okay? And that really made me feel as though my students see me as not only their professor, but also as an Asian American and Asian American woman. And so that's part of the work in terms of, doing, the allyship, the solidarity, the collective care that is so necessary during this, time of so much collective grief.
No, that's great. I know we're coming up on time. Jim's in the background going, is she keeping track of time? Yes, Jim, I see. But speaking along those lines, when you talked about just checking in can mean so much, there have been a few questions coming in about like, well, what can I do to check in without seeming like I'm overstepping boundaries? And then there's someone who said, how can one ask about their own culture to get to know it without offending them? I'm Hispanic. I don't mind if someone asks about my culture. I'm not sure if it's disrespectful to others. And I just want to start by saying personally, I never have a problem if anybody wants to talk and ask me like, what's your background? I hate it when they say, what are you? Or they'll say, what nationality are you? And my dad taught me, he's watching. My dad taught me when I was little to always say American. If someone asks you, what's your nationality? You say American. And then if they say, what's your ethnicity, where your parents from? Then you can go into all of that. So for the anonymous attendee, even just asking and talking, I think many people can tell where that's coming from. If that's coming from a place of kindness and it's, I don't think any of us have a problem with answering some of those questions. I think it's one of those when I encounter somebody, be like, hey, what are you? What? I'm female, I'm human. I mean, what do you want to know? So I think I would love to hear kind of as closing thoughts, how do you want to encourage other people who might be uncomfortable talking to you about this, to talk not only to you, but maybe to their friends in the AAPI community? In our remaining 3 minutes, Jim. Yes, I see the clock on the corner. But Bryn, Baroxy, Bo, Devorn.
I can take this. I think that you just don't be afraid to ask questions. There's never a wrong question. And I think it's just in the way you ask it. But even if you don't know how to ask it, I think you can always just preface it by saying, I don't know, can you help me? And then ask your question. I don't think anybody would feel, badly if you just go ahead and ask. I've had really great supporters. My colleagues in my office have been great, and they have attended all the events that I have been speaking in, even though they're not Asian, because they want to be there to support me and they want to be there to support our other Asian colleagues on campus. And so I think what I would tell you is to show up, to ask questions, and not to be silent. I, for a long time, because I was a reporter, I was never active in the community because I had a potential of covering that organization or that story. But now that I'm out of media, I can participate. And so I'm very happy to be able to attend the Asian Faculty and Staff Association meetings here at Fresno State. And even though I don't have much experience to share, I can at least be there and tell them that I'm here to support them. That I'm only here to listen and to support them, that they need anything, they can always count on me. So I think that's important for everybody to know, that as long as you're there to support, to offer support, then that's great.
Thank you, Bo. Baroxy, Devorn, Bryn, anything to add before we go?
I just want to add that given this conversation about education, we have so much access to information now, more so than ever before. Social media, Twitter, Instagram. And as much as I, want to manage my daily and weekly dose of social media, there are some wonderful conversations people are having about this. And so if you're not yet comfortable engaging in conversation, pay attention to the conversations people are having on Twitter about really hard things, right? People are sharing resources. I've shared a couple in the chat. You can, there are webinars all over the place now in this time that you can come and sit and learn and absorb and kind of increase your comfort level, right? And so I just want to encourage folks that there are resources out there. There's so many grassroots local activist organizations doing this work, and they need support. And so if you have time and energy, resources to provide, support those communities so that they can really, they're the ones that are on the ground making material change happen. So social media, take advantage of it, pay attention to the conversations that are happening. Even if you don't want to get involved or not comfortable, just listen and learn from what's going on. How are people talking about these issues in ways that are pushing our boundaries to really help us center equity, center humanity, and center kind of, the humanity of folks involved in this.
Thank you so much. Devorn and Bryn, last comments of the evening from both of you.
Take our classes. Any of these wonderful panelists, find your Asian American Studies professors. They have been doing this work for decades. Take a class with them, find them on social media, follow them. I'll just add that.
I love it. And then finally.
Oh, me?
That's you.
Like all of my panelists had mentioned, take Asian American Studies courses. There is an Asian American Studies program. A lot of students take it as a GE requirement, but leave learning so much. You know, I see on the attendees list, several of my students have taken the courses, and, you know, just take courses, right? Asian American Studies courses. And we have courses, you know, on Asian American women, Asian American community, I mean, introduction to Asian American, right? Asian American race relations, right, in the US. So all of those really touch on the historical content and understanding of Asian Americans in the US.
Thank you so much to the four of you. And those of you who are doctors, you earned those titles. I'm so sorry I haven't been calling you by your titles. I figured this was safe space. We were okay. But we do have a list of resources. We've put them on the chat. We also have a screen. A graphic here we're going to share with you. Dr. Chapman, Jim, Betsy, thank you so much for inviting all of us to this important, timely discussion. And then to Bo, Bryn, Devorn, and Varaxi, your passion is inspiring to me. I've learned so much from you. And I'm always open to questions from the community to talk about this, because the only way we're going to change things is if we all share. And so it's been wonderful to hear your own personal stories as well as your professional insight. Again, this is the list of resources. You can also, later on this week, you can go visit the website for the College of Arts and Humanities at Fresno State, or their Facebook page. We will post a recording of this entire video along with a list of those resources, so that, as the panelists have said, you can peruse at your leisure. You don't have to, if you can't make it to class at Fresno State, then you know what, there are resources available to you online. Again, I am so honored and so proud to have been part of this discussion, and then hopefully we can change things. And I think we're on the right track. Thank you to everybody watching at home. We are also appreciative of your time as well. Have a great evening, everyone.